wasn't supposed to find out the way I did. Nobody plans to learn something like that standing in the break room of their own office, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, reading a group text that was never meant to include them. My name is Joanna. I'm 32 years old. I work in tax compliance for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio, and for the better part of a decade, I was the person my family called when the math didn't add up. Not because I volunteered, not because I was the loudest or the most sentimental, but because I was the one who actually understood the numbers, and more than that, I was the one who couldn't say no when someone I loved looked at me like the answer to a problem I hadn't caused. My brother, Eli, had always been the one who made things look effortless. 4 years younger than me, the kind of person who walks into a room and somehow immediately becomes the center of it, not by demanding attention, but by making everyone around him feel warmer than they did before he arrived. He was genuinely funny in the way that disarms people. He had this laugh that started slow and built until it took over his whole face, and you couldn't help it. You laughed too, even when you didn't know what you were laughing at. I loved him for it. I loved him the way you love someone who has always just been there, like furniture you'd grieve if it disappeared. His girlfriend, Petra, had come into his life about 3 years before all of this. She was pretty in a very deliberate way, like someone who had studied what pretty was supposed to look like and replicated it carefully. She wasn't unkind to me exactly, but she also never quite looked at me directly, more through me or past me, like I was a revolving door she was walking through to get to something more interesting. I told myself it was just her personality. Some people are like that. I didn't make it mean anything. The engagement happened over the holidays. Eli called me first, which surprised me, and I remember feeling genuinely warm about it, that instinct he still had to reach me before the announcement spread. He was happy in a way that seemed real and uncomplicated, and I was happy for him because of it. Petra had been less warm on the phone when she got on to say hello, but I chalked that up to the chaos of newly engaged life and let it go. What followed over the next 8 months was a slow, systematic rearrangement of my finances that I participated in willingly, even eagerly, because I believed I was helping someone I loved build something real. It started with the venue deposit. Eli mentioned offhandedly that the place they wanted, a restored farmhouse about 40 minutes outside the city, required a substantial hold to lock in the date. He said they were a little short. He said it the way he always said things like that, half apologetic, half certain I would find a way. I wired $3,000 the same afternoon. Then it was the catering minimum, which required a credit card on file. I put my visa down. Then the photographer, a woman who came highly recommended and required full payment up front, $2,200. Then the florist, who needed a deposit by the end of the month or they'd release the booking, $800. Then the rehearsal dinner venue, a private room at a restaurant downtown, which needed a reservation fee, $450. Each time, Eli told me they'd pay me back after the wedding when the gift money came in. Each time I said, okay. I kept a running spreadsheet, the way I keep track of everything, color-coded with dates and amounts and a column I labeled expected reimbursement that I never actually expected to use. It was more for my own sense of order than anything else, a way of making the generosity feel organized rather than reckless. The total, by the time I added it up on a Tuesday evening in February, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of water I kept forgetting to drink, was $11,420. I sat with that number for a while, not with regret, exactly, more with a kind of quiet clarity, the way you feel when you've been adding a column of figures, and the sum is larger than you anticipated, but the math is still correct. I wasn't supposed to be in the family group chat that night. I had been added months earlier when Eli sent around some holiday photos, and I'd muted it shortly after because the notification volume was genuinely unsustainable. I happened to open it that evening because my mother had sent a photo of her new kitchen curtains that she'd texted me about separately and said she'd also put in the group. The photo was there, so was a thread below it that had been going for about 2 hours. Petra had started it. She'd sent a message to the group, which included my aunts, a few cousins, my mother, and Eli, that read, "Quick update on the wedding logistics. We've decided to keep the ceremony itself really intimate. Immediate family and close friends only. We're going to have to trim the guest list pretty significantly, and that means some of the extended circle won't be included. No hard feelings, just want the day to feel personal and intentional. My cousin Ashley had responded with a heart emoji. My aunt had sent a prayer hands. My mother had written, "Of course, whatever makes you both happiest." Then Petra had sent a follow-up. Also, just to avoid any awkwardness, Joanna's not going to be included in the ceremony itself. She can come to the reception if she wants. We just want the ceremony to feel like the people who are actually part of our lives going forward. And honestly, the dynamic has always been a little complicated. I think this is cleaner. My mother had not responded to that one. Neither had anyone else, which I found, in the moment, almost more devastating than the message itself. I read it 3 times. Then I set my phone face down on the table and sat very still. The dynamic has always been a little complicated. I turned that sentence over a few times. I tried to find the version of myself that Petra was describing, the complicated one. The one who warranted being quietly edited out of her brother's wedding while still, presumably, being welcome at the reception like a vendor or a distant acquaintance. I thought about the $3,000 wire transfer. I thought about the florist deposit. I thought about the rehearsal dinner I'd paid for that I was apparently not invited to witness. I picked up my phone and opened my notes app. I do this when I'm upset, not to process feelings, but to think clearly. I wrote down everything I paid in order with dates. Then I opened my banking app and pulled up the actual transactions, cross-referenced them, and confirmed the total. $11,420. I put the phone down again. Made a cup of tea I didn't drink. Stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the parking lot for what was probably longer than I realized. Then I went back to the group chat. I didn't say anything dramatic. I didn't call anyone a name or type in all caps or make any kind of speech. I just wrote, "Got it. That makes sense. I'll start unwinding the financial commitments I made on your behalf. Should have everything sorted within the week." Then I put the phone in my bag and went to bed. They thought I meant something small. I could tell from the 2 responses that came in before I turned off my notifications, a question mark from my cousin and a "wait what" from Eli, that nobody had processed what I was actually saying. They thought I was canceling a gift registry contribution or backing out of some minor favor. They had no idea that my name was on every single contract. I was at my desk by 7 the next morning. I had blocked off my calendar for the first 2 hours and I used them methodically. The venue was first. The farmhouse had a cancellation policy I'd read carefully when I signed the initial paperwork, because I am professionally someone who reads cancellation policies. Cancellations made more than 90 days before the event received a full refund minus a $250 administrative fee. The wedding was 4 months out. I called the number on the contract, explained I was the cardholder and the signatory, and canceled the reservation. The woman on the phone was brisk and professional. She told me a confirmation would be emailed to the address on file, which was mine. The caterer had a similar window. Their policy was slightly more complicated, involving a tiered refund schedule, but I had paid the initial deposit, not the full minimum, and I was still within the full refund period. I filled out their online cancellation form and received an automated confirmation within 4 minutes. The photographer required a phone call. She was warm and a little confused. I told her there had been a change in the event planning and I needed to release the booking. She asked if I wanted to reschedule. I said no. She processed the refund without argument. She'd had a cancellation that morning from another client, she said, and she probably rebooked the date quickly. I thanked her and meant it. The florist was the only one who pushed back, not unkindly, but she'd already ordered some specialty items and wanted to discuss options. I told her I understood and that I was happy to forfeit the deposit rather than put her in a difficult position. She seemed genuinely surprised by that. We worked out an arrangement where she'd keep the deposit, release the booking, and I'd walk away owing nothing further. I thanked her for her professionalism. By 9:15, I had documentation of every cancellation in my inbox. I forwarded each one to Eli with no additional text. Just the emails, one after the other, arriving in his inbox like a slow and very deliberate drumbeat. I didn't hear back from him immediately. I heard from my mother first, around 11, a call I let go to voicemail because I was in a meeting and also because I needed a few more hours before I was ready to have that conversation. Her voicemail was 40 seconds long. She said I was being reactive. She said Petra hadn't meant it the way it sounded. She said I was going to ruin everything over a misunderstanding and that I needed to call her back right away. I listened to it twice during my lunch break, sitting in my car in the parking garage with a sandwich I was only partially eating. The word that stayed with me was reactive. I had spent the morning calmly and systematically processing $11,000 in cancellations, reading every policy document, making polite phone calls, and arranging clean exits from every financial commitment I'd made on behalf of two people who had, in a group text, decided I was complicated enough to uninvite from my brother's wedding ceremony. Reactive felt like the wrong word. Thorough felt more accurate. I called my mother back at 2. She led with, "You have to understand Petra's perspective," which is a thing I have noticed people say when they want you to adopt someone else's perspective without being required to consider yours. I let her talk for a while. She said Petra was stressed. She said the wedding planning had been overwhelming. She said Eli was upset. I waited until she finished. Then I told her, calmly and without editorial, what I had spent over the past 8 months. The venue, the catering deposit, the photographer, the florist, the rehearsal dinner reservation, the total. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "I didn't know it was that much," she finally said. "I know," I said. "That's part of the problem." She didn't have an answer for that. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes without saying much, and then I told her I had to get back to work. And I did. Eli called that evening. I picked up. He didn't apologize, which I had not expected but had allowed myself to briefly hope for. He said I had blown up months of planning and that I had done it out of spite, because I was always like this when I felt left out of things. I let him get through most of it before I asked him to tell me, specifically, what I had ever done to make Petra feel that the dynamic was complicated. He went quiet. He said it wasn't about specific things, it was more of a general feeling, a vibe. I told him I understood. I told him that I would always love him, and that I wished him and Petra genuinely well, and that I hoped the rest of the wedding planning went smoothly. I told him I'd be happy to forward him documentation of all the deposits so he could re-establish the vendor relationships directly if he wanted to salvage the bookings, though he'd need to move quickly given the timelines. He hung up before I finished the sentence. My mother texted that night. One message, "You humiliated this family." No punctuation at the end. Just the sentence, sitting there like a verdict. I put my phone on the charger across the room, made myself a bowl of cereal, and watched 2 episodes of a show I'd been meaning to finish for 3 months. Then I went to sleep. Here's what I had known for about 6 weeks before any of this happened, a thing I had been turning over quietly in the back of my mind while still paying florist deposits and confirming catering minimums. I had a work colleague, Danny, who was one of those people who exists in adjacent social circles to everyone in your life without ever being at the center of any of them. She'd gone to the same gym as Petra for a while. She'd mentioned it offhandedly once, in the context of something else, and I hadn't thought much of it. About 6 weeks before the group text, Danny had pulled me aside after a team lunch. She'd looked uncomfortable in a way that people look when they have information they feel obligated to share and would prefer not to be the one sharing it. She told me she'd overheard something at the gym, a conversation between Petra and a friend of hers, and she felt like I should probably know. What she'd heard was this: Petra and her friend talking in the locker room, Petra saying that my brother's sister, she hadn't used my name but the description was unambiguous, was basically a built-in budget line that they'd been working around for years, and that once the wedding was done, they were planning to put some real distance there because it was starting to feel transactional in a way that was getting uncomfortable. Transactional. That word did something specific to me that I'm not entirely sure how to describe. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was more like looking at a photograph you thought you recognized and slowly realizing the people in it are strangers. I had not said anything to anyone about what Danny told me. I went home that evening and I pulled up my spreadsheet, the one with the color-coded columns, and I looked at it for a long time. And then I added a new column I hadn't included before. I labeled it Notes. In the Notes column, I wrote for every entry a brief description of the conversation that preceded the payment. Eli calling me on a Sunday morning sounding stressed. Eli mentioning casually that the deposit deadline was coming up. Eli saying he'd figure something out in a tone that meant he was waiting for me to offer. When I was done, I saved the file. I backed it up to my cloud drive, and then I went to bed and didn't think about it again, actively, until the night I opened the group chat and found out I was complicated. I want to be honest about something. I did not cancel those vendors out of pure principle. I canceled them because of what Danny told me and what I knew and what I had been quietly digesting for 6 weeks. The group chat message was the last data point in a pattern I had already identified. I was not reacting. I was concluding. There was one more thing. In the weeks after, when the calls had mostly stopped and the group chat had gone quiet and I had returned to my regular routines with a steadiness that surprised even me, I got an email from the photographer. She'd rebooked the date, as she'd predicted, but she'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to reach out. She had a sister, she wrote. A longer note than I'd expected. She'd been in a situation, years ago, where she'd been asked to keep giving to keep the peace, and she'd done it for so long she'd forgotten that peace wasn't actually what she'd been buying. She wasn't sure why she was telling me, except that something in our phone call had stayed with her. She hoped I was doing okay. I read that email 4 times. Then I responded briefly to thank her, and I meant it more than I usually mean things I say quickly. I went to therapy for the first time in March. Not a crisis, just a decision. The way you finally schedule a dentist appointment you've been putting off because you know it's the responsible thing, and you're finally ready to sit in the chair. My therapist is a woman in her 50s named Dr. Dye Aldridge, and she has a clock on her desk that I sometimes find myself watching during the parts of the session. I'm not sure how to fill. In one of our early sessions, she asked me when I had first learned that being useful was safer than being present. I didn't have a clean answer. I gave her several partial ones. She nodded at each of them like she was collecting pieces of something she wasn't ready to assemble yet. We're still working on it. Eli and Petra did get married. A smaller ceremony, according to my cousin Ashley, who told me more than I probably needed to know over text one afternoon in April. They used a different venue, shorter guest list, and from the one photo Ashley sent, which I looked at once and then archived, it seemed like a real day, a real moment, something that belonged to them. I was not in it. I made peace with that in stages, and then one Tuesday morning I realized I'd actually made peace with it, not as a performance for myself, but genuinely, and I filed that away as progress. My brother and I have not spoken since the phone call. I've left that door the way you leave a door when you're not sure whether to lock it or just close it quietly and see what happens. Not locked, not propped open, just shut. My mother calls on the first Sunday of every month now. We talk about her garden and her book club and sometimes about Eli in a way that doesn't require me to perform a reaction. It's not what we were before, but it's something, and something is more than nothing, and I'm learning to hold both of those truths without deciding one of them cancels the other out. I am, by every measure I can apply, fine. I renewed my lease in February. I restarted the retirement contributions I'd let lapse during the years when I was covering things I should not have been covering. I bought myself a dining table I had been putting off because there were always other things to spend money on. A real one, solid oak, the kind that requires 2 people to move it. Though I carried it in myself in pieces and assembled it on a Saturday afternoon with a podcast and a glass of wine and the particular satisfaction of something built exactly to your own specifications. I have a friend from my firm, Renata, who came over for dinner last month and sat at that table and said it looked like something someone actually lived in, which was the best thing anyone had said to me in Hold. Renata knows most of this story. She was the person who drove me home the night the group text happened, after I called her from the parking lot of my building. Not crying exactly, but close enough that I didn't trust myself to go inside alone yet. She sat with me on my couch for 2 hours and didn't try to fix it. She just sat there. I think about that more than I expected to. I'm not going to say I have a lesson for you. I have a suspicion that lessons are tidier in retrospect than they are in the actual experience of them, and I don't want to sand down the complicated parts to make the ending feel cleaner than it was. What I can say is this. At some point in the months that followed, I went back to that spreadsheet, the one with the color-coded columns and the notes. I renamed the file. I had originally called it something practical and forgettable, the way I name most of my files. I renamed it what I cost myself. Not because I wanted to sit with that idea, but because I wanted to be honest about what the record actually showed. It wasn't just money I'd given. It was attention, energy, the mental real estate of all those Sunday afternoons spent thinking about someone else's catering minimums. It was every time I'd stayed small and convenient so the room felt big enough for everyone else. The table is oak. The retirement account is funded. The dining chair across from mine has been empty most nights, and some nights that feels like loss, and other nights it just feels like space. The good kind, the kind you can actually breathe in. I'm still figuring out which feeling is more accurate. I think that might be the work. I keep coming back to the spreadsheet. Not the numbers themselves, but the column I added last, the one labeled Notes, where I wrote down every conversation that came before every payment. Eli calling on a Sunday, sounding stretched thin. The way he'd say, "I'll figure something out," in a tone that meant he was already certain I would. I had documented the pattern long before I'd let myself name it, which tells me something about the gap between what we understand and what we're willing to act on. That gap is where a lot of quiet damage gets done. What happened to me wasn't unusual. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with. Families find their load bearers early and they don't renegotiate the arrangement unless someone forces the issue. I had been the person who forces the issue exactly once in my life, and it cost me a brother's phone calls and a mother's easy approval and a seat at a ceremony I had, in the most literal sense, paid for. Those are real losses. I'm not going to dress them up as gifts. But here's what I've come to believe. Slowly, and without any clean moment of revelation, the losses were the consequence of a correction, not a punishment. I had spent years operating on a kind of moral credit system where generosity was supposed to accumulate into belonging. It doesn't work that way. Belonging isn't a balance that tips once you've deposited enough. It's either offered freely or it isn't offered at all, and no amount of catering deposits changes that arithmetic. Recognizing that, really recognizing it, not just as a thought but as something I actually felt in my chest, required me to be honest in a way I had been avoiding. Honesty with yourself is harder than honesty with other people because there's no one to perform it for. You either do it or you don't. What gave me the clarity to act wasn't anger. Anger came and went in waves, mostly at night, mostly in the first 2 weeks. What lasted was something quieter, a kind of intellectual stubbornness, a refusal to keep pretending that the pattern I had carefully documented didn't mean what it obviously meant. I had the skills to read a contract, trace a financial timeline, and understand what the record showed. Using those skills on my own life felt uncomfortable in a way that surprised me. We're often more willing to apply rigor to problems that belong to other people. And then there was the harder part. Rebuilding after. The table. The retirement contributions. Dinner with Renata. These aren't dramatic acts. They don't make for a satisfying montage. But the willingness to keep going, to keep building something real and mine even when the people I expected to be in it had stepped out, that required a kind of sustained effort that I think people underestimate. It's easy to make one decisive phone call. It's harder to get up the next morning and the morning after that and keep choosing yourself without bitterness curling into the edges of it. I'm not there entirely. Some mornings I still reach for things that aren't where I left them, but I'm learning to trust the room as it actually is, not as I arranged it in my head for someone else's comfort. That, I think, is the actual work.